Hello and welcome to this masterclass on future priming your leadership career. My name is Eszter Molnar Mills, and I've been in the field of leadership development for about 20 years. But over the last 18 months or so, I've been thinking long and hard about what the future will hold for leaders. And I wonder whether you've been thinking about how you feel about the future of your own leadership career. What might be required of you? What might be the opportunities that you have access to? And what might be some of the challenges that are coming up? You see, about 18 months ago, in spite of having spent the previous near enough 20 years in leadership development, I've had a bit of a crisis of confidence around whether we are giving leaders what they really need to be ready not just for the world of work today, but also for the future. And what I'm going to be sharing with you today is a culmination of some of that thinking. So we're going to talk about the 5 common leadership responses that people might have when it comes to facing the future, and which one you might choose to opt into to cultivate in yourself. We're also going to look at a framework we have developed that will help you take action and avoid being left behind. I'm also going to share with you one of my favorite tools for thinking about the future and really considering what our career future might look like so that you can decide on some next steps to remain in control of your own career. But before we do that, I just wanted to share with you a few key points about the last time there was a significant shift in the world of work. And that was when Industry 4.0, so the fourth industrial revolution, took place. And that's meant a really significant upheaval to primarily manufacturing industries and industries where there are a lot of machinery and process. And Industry 4.0 required some really significant changes to the companies and the workers that functioned in industry. This involved new technology. But not just new technology. New technology brought with us significant new processes and procedures, and that required new organizational capabilities. And ultimately, in lots of cases, that meant that there were also new business models which were established. The upheavals of Industry 4.0 are now very much coming for the white-collar worker also. And what's interesting about this is that although the disruption was driven by technological change or opportunity, a lot of what thinkers were then establishing is that the behaviors of leadership that were required in these new ways of working were very much interpersonal. So Wharton Business School wrote a number of reports. In one of them, they're setting out that fundamental leadership behaviors are required to bring culture change to organizations entering Industry 4.0. And these included openness, resilience, inclusiveness, humility, and self-awareness. So a lot of these were either individual or collective leadership behaviors or interpersonal behaviors. And in fact, they've identified that the core skills to nudge organizational culture into Industry 4.0 were adaptability, collaboration, curiosity, conviction, judgment, and most of all, listening. And I would argue that a number of those approaches are going to be relevant for us as everyone faces the future of work. Adaptability being a critical one of them. And that's important because the future of work, wherever you work, is disruption. There are really significant disruptive elements, whether those are to do with technology, artificial intelligence being at the forefront of this, but by no means being the singular cause of disruption at work. But we're also seeing a number of other shifts, one of which is a changed employer-employee relationship. People simply expect slightly different things from their workplace, primarily since the pandemic, but not exclusively. A number of the trends that are sped up by the pandemic were actually already in the works. People have different expectations, much more requirement for flexibility. And there's also a lot of disruption into how we work, a much more contingent workforce, and a multi-generational workforce, as well as a whole host of other drivers. At a recent webinar, when we asked colleagues what were some of the key things, a good number of these were highlighted, a lot around the changed employer-employee relationship and also the drivers around having to do more with less. And some of these disruptors are going to be challenging. Some, of course, are going to be beneficial in that they're going to create new jobs, new opportunities. So if we're thinking about our career growth, growth, we might see aspects like big data analytics, which is something that's coming to the forefront of many organizations' thinking. And a really central part of that is going to be jobs growth. So new opportunities in that type of work. We're also seeing artificial intelligence. Now, I would argue that we're now closer to the tipping point here. AI is still adding jobs, but quite possibly it is now adding slightly fewer jobs than it is replacing. It's certainly replacing parts of people's work, and we need to think about how do we respond to that. But the green transition, whether that is for the purposes of environmental protection or whether that's for the purposes of energy security, is also something that is adding jobs at the moment and significant future opportunities. And climate change adaptation, where we're not talking primarily about how do we prevent climate change, but how do we respond to the weather events, for example, that are caused by climate change. All in all, these are just 4 areas of examples, but all in all, according to McKinsey at least, 44% of workers' core skills are expected to change in the next 5 years. And you might have already seen that in yourself and your own team, that there is a shift towards maybe more data-driven decision-making, maybe much more use of artificial intelligence, and quite possibly shifts in terms of meeting customer needs in different ways also. But it's not just about the work and the skills. It's also about the makeup of our team. So when we're talking about the future of leadership careers, we need to think about what will the teams look like or the organizations that we are leading. And Bain & Co. found that by 2031, so in about 6 years' time, a quarter of the workforce in G7 member states will be aged 55 or older. And we're seeing this in lots of industries, that as people are healthier for longer, they're living for longer, they also have opportunities to stay in work longer, whilst we still have 16, 17, 18-year-olds joining the workforce. So we're now seeing a multi-generational workforce with some significant late career, very established colleagues, as well as a big cohort of early career colleagues joining us. And that poses its own leadership challenge. According to Deloitte, 20% of organizations said that multi-generational workforces was important or very important for their success over the next 12 to 18 months, because you're trying to balance getting the most out of your established colleagues whilst also bringing on board your early career people. However, only 10% of them have then said that they were ready to address this trend. Now, you might say, well, it's not necessarily something you need to address. It will just happen and we'll deal with it. But actually, in a different study, 28% of people felt that the multi-generational workplace could lead to conflict. Different life stages, different expectations, maybe different values underpinning some of our thinking might mean that when you're leading a team or an organization of people between 18 and 70 or 17 and 70, you might have some conflict. How do we best deal with that? How do we integrate our teams no matter what their makeup is? Not just in terms of age, actually, but certainly the multi-generational workforce is something that's strengthening very much recently. But there's also differences in terms of the status of our colleagues. Very many organizations are building a much more fragmented contingent workforce. And a bit of an extreme example of this is Unilever. They have 150,000 global employees who are on their payroll, but they have an outer core of contingent workers, their supply chain in terms of third parties, and their agency workers who make up 3 million other people. So we've got a really significant external core. Whilst almost half of office workers say that they will leave if their employer doesn't offer them sufficient flexibility. Flexibility is becoming a real workplace benefit, effectively. And people are making some big decisions around whether their current employer is flexible enough. And speaking of that generational shift, maybe workers aged 25 to 34 say 60% of them will leave if they're not getting sufficient flexibility. Now, you will notice, of course, this is partly about life stages. 25 to 34, you might be seeing people settling down, young families possibly, or people wanting to very proactively use their time off, and therefore there might be a greater demand for flexibility. And in response to this, as well as in response to understanding about how we actually work and technological advances, over the last few years in the UK, we saw a big pilot for the 4-day week campaign. 92% of companies who participated in that said that they're going to stay with their 4-day work week. Remember, that makes the assumption that people don't produce any less, but they also don't make any less money. They just truncate their work into 4 days worth of full-time hours. So it's not concentrated hours, it's not longer days, it is the same length of day, but people are able to work in a more concentrated way where they have more rest time. And organizations, of course, are responding to all of this with a range of workforce strategies. Some of the reasons why you're seeing this is because organizations are expanding the use of contract work. But they're doing other things as well. They're investing and learning and training on the job. We're still seeing examples of skill shortages. And if we think about the number of jobs that will require significant new skills, no wonder. They are also thinking about accelerating the automation of processes, and that is partly enabled by technology, partly a cost-cutting measure, of course. And they might be transitioning their colleagues from jobs in decline into growing roles. So you're seeing all of these previous trends play out at an organizational strategy level. So that means that if each of us want to be successful leading our organizations and our teams, which are much more technology driven, maybe, which need to have much more adaptability for the uncertainties of the external environment, which provides flexibility, provides that continuous opportunity to work, we need different approaches to leadership as well. And this was part of my own realization. So about 18 months ago, I was actually in the gym listening to an audiobook. And it really dawned on me suddenly that I wasn't quite sure whether what we were providing leaders with in terms of development opportunities are really giving them everything they need for the future. So some of the key things that have arisen from my research and practice since then culminate in a few key ideas. So new leadership approaches are going to be necessary. We need to be much more empowering in leadership. We need to be much more flexible in our approach. We need to be ready to lead not just a team that has colleagues with significantly different backgrounds. We also need to be ready to lead a team that might be partially made up of AI agents and partially made up of contingent workers. And that requires us to develop new skills and also new mindsets, really give us the opportunity to rethink what we imagine our team to be. And that also means that we need to establish new systems and new ways of working. We need to renegotiate the contract between ourselves and our team members. And we need to think about how do we future-proof our work, our strategies, but also the solutions that we provide. And as part of that, we do need to establish a new employee relationship. How do we make sure that we're getting the best out of our human colleagues, our full-time colleagues, but we're also integrating any contingent workers, and we're also learning to work alongside technology really effectively. Now, when faced with this much disruption out there, some leaders respond to this saying, actually, I'm fine. Really, this is already how I have been leading my team, which is brilliant. But for many others, a different set of responses arise. And these are some examples of what I've seen working with dozens and dozens of organizations over the last number of years. There are some common leadership responses to the future of work. Many of them have some drawbacks, but you have the opportunity to choose your own option. So the first one is the Labrador. So the Labrador has that kind of energy and enthusiasm, but is not particularly strategic. So our Labrador can't see the future. It's confused by the different options going forward, and it can chase its tail quite a lot. And it might also bolt off for a bit with a lot of energy, but not very much thinking and planning. So there's a lot of effort and enthusiasm that goes into embracing the future here, but not a lot of strategy, and therefore it's not leading to systemic results. And that matters for us because we're burning away a lot of the energy that could be better directed. And I think over the last couple of years, we've seen this a lot in terms of people's adoption of artificial intelligence. A lot of people have been out there playing. and producing all sorts of fun things with AI, but not necessarily producing meaningful work. Almost on the opposite end, in terms of energy expansion, we've got the tortoise. So the tortoise is quite scared about the future, not quite sure what the threat might be, still overwhelmed. But the tortoise's reaction, in contrast to the energetic jumping forward of the lab, the tortoise's reaction is to withdraw to the safe, knowable spaces. They focus on the core aspects of the work, and they're trying to keep things on an even keel. And that hiding in the shell might work for a short period of time, but tortoises are at a significant risk from being left behind as the rest of the world moves forward, and as organizational expectations change around them as well. On the energetic end, we've got grasshoppers, but grasshoppers sit still and wait to see what will happen. They're holding off for a while. And then when they feel, I can't hold off any longer, I've got to make a move now, I'm worried about maybe being left behind. Everybody else is working in a particular way. Everybody else is doing something. I've got to do something. They leap, but they don't necessarily leap in the right direction. And that leap takes a lot of effort. It might involve quite significant risk, but it's often away from, I've got to jump, so I'm just going to jump now, rather than necessarily being purposeful in its direction. And it also doesn't necessarily land safely. That jump is a bit unpredictable. Our fourth example of approaches is that of the bee. So our bee works very hard, is very busy. They focus on complex procedures and networks, and they get the daily stuff done. They are preparing for the future, but they're preparing for the future that they have already lived. So they're making assumptions that the future of their requirements is going to be the same as the past. And so what that means is that they're going to be successful if the future moves forward exactly as they assume. But because they're only ready for one version of the future, they're at risk at novel external factors. So in the context of the bee, this could be intruders or pesticides, but it might, in the context of organizational leadership, it might be a requirement to be much more agile, for example, that would meet them unawares or unready. So the animal that we would most like to emulate then is in fact the octopus. So the octopus has a nervous system that actually is represented in the whole of its body. It searches by extending its tentacles. It almost develops a hypothesis and then tests it out. So the octopus is always ready to read the external environment, seeks to understand it by probing it, by putting itself forward in a fairly safe way, taking that information on board and then planning its next steps. So the octopus progresses by testing, exploring in different directions, and then learning. And it's very good at adapting to its environment. It's flexible, it's adaptable, it's very agile in its decision making. And critically, it's decentralized. So the octopus's nervous system isn't just located in its brain. Individual limbs can take action without central command. And we're seeing that the more complex our world becomes, the more we need to trust that members of our team can act independently of our central control, for example. So that willingness to test the environment, that willingness to adapt, that willingness to constantly learn, then the willingness to allow decisions to be taken closest to the information is what represents the octopus. So what I would like you to think about is, are you in that position? Or do you recognize some elements of the other examples in your own behavior? Do you find that when under pressure, maybe you do retreat to what is already understood and well known? Do you have some tortoise tendencies when things move too fast or where you're already under pressure? Do you occasionally find that you're holding back, and then you've got to do something because everyone else is? So there's some grasshopper tendencies. Or do you actually have huge amounts of energy? You're just not quite sure that all the exploration is giving you what you need. Or do you find that actually you're already using the agile approach and that engagement with the environment and continuous learning that the octopus represents? And I love this quote: when you do the things in the present that you can see, you're shaping the future that you are yet to see. So there's something here about what steps are we choosing to take now And are those steps going to support us or going to make our lives more challenging? And we have a framework that hopefully helps us think about how we can position ourselves more in the ready octopus state. This is the PRIME framework. And you might see that it's framed with a positive surround, because we believe that to thrive in the future, we need to start by developing a combination of foresight and flexibility. But a lot of that can be supported by starting with positive management and leadership approaches, starting with the assumption that part of our role as leaders is to help other people flourish around us, and ensuring that we as leaders also have the opportunity to. So that positive approach, that consideration of strengths, of opportunities, is the one that helps us create a really strong foundation. So our invitation is that we start with that positive frame. What can we learn from our successes? How can we lean into our strengths to overcome challenges? What are some of the positive behaviors that we can encourage in our teams that will make them more willing to take some reasonable risks, for example? So that positive approach works very well as an underpinning. It also helps us feel more secure and therefore less likely to retreat into that tortoise setting. When we feel that we're starting from a position of strength, where we've got a positive team around us, where we have some great grounding, we're more likely to be willing to risk coming out of our shell. But we also need to proactively engage with the future. And reimagine is the second part of this model. And this is about challenging our thinking about what the future could bring. Reimagine is particularly effective in reducing the likelihood that we will fall into the traps of the bee, where we are only working towards one set future. And if that future doesn't come about, then we're caught unawares. Reimagine is about using foresight tools to think about different versions of the future that might happen. It's not about trying to predict the future, which we can't do, but what we can do is we can identify alternative versions of the future and then start thinking about how we might best respond, no matter which of those comes about. So this is about considering that complexity from multiple perspectives. And in our next masterclass, we're actually going to share a particular tool that we use for this to help colleagues come up with, and teams come up with different versions of the future that might impact their work, their industry even, or their organization. The next step then is to actually do something about this. Once we've created alternative versions of the future, we've talked about this idea of balancing foresight, which is the previous step, with flexibility. Implementing is about not holding back, but taking some steps forward, some calculated, appropriate next steps, taking action now so that we can meet the future halfway, but making sure that we're strategic in that thinking. This step is also about bringing agility and adaptability into our day-to-day work. This step might include piloting, testing various things, allowing people to take some reasonable risks on behalf of our organization so that we can gather more information about the environment. And we can de-risk some of those next steps by having identified the alternative version of the future. We can think about what next step is going to be safe or useful or most impactful, no matter which version of the future actually comes about. This helps us from targeting our energy appropriately. So this stops us from being too much like the Labrador, where we're all over the place and we're expending too much energy into unknowns. But it also stops us from holding back too long and then jumping like the grasshopper. This is about purposeful small steps that then help us implement something, learn from that, bring it back, reflect on it, and then establish what might be a more extensive next step. But all of this requires us to learn from those tests, but it also requires us to develop an element of learning agility. We've been talking a lot of late with leaders about the topic of learning agility, our ability to learn, but also to unlearn some of the past ways of working or information that is no longer fit for purpose. It's not to say that it wasn't excellent in the past, But if it's not serving us going forward, if it's not going to be relevant going forward, we need to be able to adapt and thrive. So metacognition here is thinking about our thinking so that we're ready to adapt. We're ready to learn. We're ready to unlearn. We're recognizing the thought processes that are maybe stuck in a version of the environment that's not there any longer. So again, it stops us from being too stuck in the past as the bee, but it still allows us to get the very best learning out from past experiences. And then, a bit like our octopus's nervous system, where all of the decisions aren't happening in its brain, a lot of these decisions are happening in its tentacles. We need to empower our colleagues to meet the challenges of the future. They need to be engaged, motivated, confident, and capable. Leaders will not be able to make all the decisions centrally. It's just not going to be possible for any of us to hold all of that information, simply because the pace of change and the complexity of the environment means that we cannot possibly take everything into account. We need to empower our colleagues to do a lot of that work, to take decisions closest to the appropriate information. And that stops us from both being the bee, where it's using very preset structures, very preset rules of work and engagement, but it also helps us dissuade our colleagues from being the tortoise, from not taking any steps forward. So those are the 4 aspects of the future prime model. And if we can bring all of them together, if we can reimagine the future, take steps now to get better understanding about it, recognize when our thinking is serving us, but also recognize when it's not serving us, and empower colleagues around us to work at their best, that will help all of us take steps forward. Now, if you're interested in this, we do have a white paper that you can download from our website. It's at formium.co.uk/future-white-paper. So you have access to that if you so wish, and there's a few more details and quite a lot of tools and techniques that can be used throughout the prime model. You can embed all or some of this into your working. You can have conversations about this with your team members and craft an approach that you're collectively taking towards the future. But we did set out to not just talk about what might be required of you as a leader, which of course hopefully is answered by the prime model. We also said that we were going to talk about tools for assessing, planning, and addressing your personal career future. And for this, we're going to take a look at the Ikigai model. Now, this is a Japanese model deeply rooted in complex Japanese philosophy. So it's worth mentioning that the way that we tend to think of it or use it in the West is not a true representation of how it's actually used in Japan, but it still provides us with a really useful framework in its current format, in its sort of westernized format. And Ikigai suggests that our career sweet spot is at the combination of what we love to do. What are we enthused by? What do we enjoy doing? And what we do well. So these are our talents, our skills, our experiences, our expertise, but also what the world might need. So what are some of the things that are truly beneficial for society, for our colleagues? And finally, when it comes to jobs, what the world pays for. Not necessarily the person who benefits from it, but that someone will fund. And in the midst of all 4 of these aspects, we can see a combination of opportunities. So between what we love and what we do well, we might find our passion. So this could possibly be a hobby. This could be if you play an instrument or if you do art, that sort of thing. Between what you love and what the world needs might be your mission. This might be something where you're volunteering, where you're undertaking activism, that sort of thing. Where what the world needs meets what the world pays for is where we see our vocation. And I think many of us have worked in jobs where it wasn't necessarily what we most enjoyed or what we did at our best, but it was something that was required and someone was willing to fund it and we were happy to do it, at least for a period of time. Hopefully, in the intersection of what the world will pay for and what you do well, we're going to find your profession. But it's in the midst of all of this where you're combining an element of satisfaction, fulfillment, contentment, and comfort at the midst of all of this, where we're bringing the best out of all of these feelings, is where we see our career sweet spot. I'd love to encourage you to reflect on this. Is your current role in that sweet spot? Is that reflective of you at your best, but also what fulfills you, what you enjoy doing, and what is making a positive difference for the world? Now, when it comes to a future, though, you might be looking at that and you might think, well, in 10 years' time, that role in its current makeup might not exist, or even in 3 years' time. What do I do then? So this is what I would like to invite you to think about, applying actually the prime model to your own individual career. So first, then moves from just covering what you currently love to also thinking about what you could learn to love. What might be some of the things that you think, well, there's going to be a call for this going forward, and I think this could be really, really exciting. You know, in my case, about a year ago, I started wondering whether artificial intelligence, obviously being at the forefront of a lot of thinking, is this something that I could possibly learn to like and engage with? And in order to decide that, I then went and undertook an AI-powered coaching certification, because I thought, well, actually, coaching is something that I do well, and I wondered whether I could learn to do more with coaching and artificial intelligence together. So if you think about the prime model, I've done some reimagining of the future, although it wasn't very, very surprising to think that artificial intelligence is going to be absolutely everywhere. But I then implemented. I went on that program in order to get a sense of whether this is something that I could learn to do well and learn to learn. And what we then think about, moving away from just ourselves to the world, what will the world need? And so in our case, you know, we're firmly thinking that new leadership thinking is going to be something that the world will need. Leaders will need that support in addressing the challenges or the disruption of future work. And what will the world pay for? Now, this is, of course, a useful question for all of us to ask, but it's helped by our reimagining. Where do we think our industry is headed? What might be some of the opportunities or challenges that we can then lean into, where there is going to be funding for certain activities? And could that possibly overlap with what we either already love or might come to enjoy, and what we can learn to do well, or what we already do well? So the Ikigai model can help us project, not just think about where are we now, but also where could we be in the future, personally, in terms of our loves and our skills, but also in terms of your industry, in terms of the world of work altogether. My invitation to you, therefore, is to think about, does this reflect your current career sweet spot, your work today? And is there a version of the future that you could lean into? That if you took a positive, a strength-based, a resource-based approach to planning for your own personal career future, could you envisage what the world might require, but also what you might learn to add to your loves, passions, and skill sets, so that you have a career path that is future primed, that will still give you fulfilling opportunities where you can make a great contribution to the world going forward. So have a bit of a think about what might be the next steps that you can take. If some or all of this resonated with you, do have a think about, how do you measure up against that octopus? If that speaks to you, if you think, actually, I can see how that would be useful, how do you measure up against that? And what might be some specific next steps that you can take? What would you like to test or pilot? Do you need to spend some time really engaging with different versions of the future? Do you need to have a strength conversation in your team to see your future readiness within your organization or with your colleagues? Again, if that were useful, do download our white paper. And if you have any questions or would like to follow up, you have the opportunity to get in touch with us. Always happy to have discussions about where leaders are headed, what would most serve you, what would be most beneficial for you. So with that, thank you very much. My name is Eszter Molnar Mills, and I would love to have conversations with you if you so choose about the future of your leadership. Thank you.